Russia has suffered such extensive losses of modern military equipment that it has been forced to rely on obsolete Soviet-era systems. Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles rapidly detect advancing targets and destroy them with high precision. Everything Russia once believed it understood about the art of maneuver warfare has been reduced to rubble, and Putin now confronts the consequences. Russia has failed in maneuver warfare, leaving Putin with no viable exit. None of this would be apparent if one accepted the statements of Putin, his commanders, and the Kremlin at face value. Russian disinformation about events on the battlefield in Ukraine remains intense, most notably the persistent claim that Russian forces control Kupiansk. Before proceeding to the main analysis, comment number 2 if you support Ukraine, number 3 if you support Russia, and number 4 if you favor peace. The city is located in Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast on the banks of the Oskil River, approximately 40 miles from the Russia-Ukraine border. According to UNN reporting, Kupiansk is the second-largest rail hub in the Kharkiv region, making it a high-value logistics objective for Putin. Putin claims Russian forces hold Kupiansk. Putin is lying. As will be detailed below, Russia's failure to capture Kupiansk demonstrates the collapse of maneuver warfare tactics that Ukrainian forces have rendered ineffective in practice. In a January 29 interview with Jason J. Smart of the Kyiv Post, former U.S. Navy SEAL Chuck Farrer disclosed that Russia has again claimed control of a city it has never captured. One of the most striking elements, and now a recurring embarrassment, is that yesterday, for at least the 4th time at the highest levels of the Kremlin, including the minister and defense minister levels and the chief of the general staff, officials continued to assert that Russian forces occupy Kupiansk. Parker described the claim as entirely false, and he is correct. There was a period in 2025 when Russia appeared close to overrunning Kupiansk. That moment has long passed, and Ukrainian forces now control the majority of the city. By mid-December, Ukraine had liberated 90% of Kupiansk and was working to clear the remaining 10%. On February 3rd, the Kyiv Independent reported that Ukrainian troops liberated additional positions inside the city while repelling large-scale Russian assaults. Just days earlier, on January 27, the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, issued a sharp assessment of purported Russian battlefield gains at Kupiansk, concluding that such advances existed only on paper. In reality, according to ISW, Ukrainian forces maintained their positions and likely advanced toward Kupiansk. Russian claims of capturing the city are an illusion, a smokescreen, a falsehood emanating from the highest levels of the Kremlin that is being exposed not only by Ukraine, but also by voices inside Russia itself. As Farrer noted, some in Russia appear to recognize that the emperor has no clothes, as military bloggers directly contradict the official narrative, suggesting Kupiansk must exist in an alternate reality. The city does not, but Putin and his subordinates do.
They must, because they are ignoring what is actually occurring at places like Kupiansk in order to sustain the collapsing narrative that Russia is an unstoppable power Ukraine cannot resist. Ukraine can resist Russia. It has done so for 4 years, and that Kupiansk, it has even reversed significant Russian gains to liberate a key city. The illusion Putin has constructed has been stripped away as the cheap tricks of a stage magician, and even Russian citizens are beginning to see that the rabbit was in the hat all along. What then is the actual situation on the ground? It begins with massive losses of equipment and resources across all categories. Russia is running out of the tanks required for the style of warfare Putin favors, though that topic will be examined in greater depth later.
At a broader level, Farrer stated that Putin is trapped in a distorted feedback loop in which fanciful reports are transmitted from the front, while reality on the ground is far worse for Russian troops. This is particularly true of Putin's most valuable resource, manpower. Russian daily personnel losses routinely hover around 1,000. The figure was slightly lower on February 3rd, when Russia lost 760 soldiers in a single day. 2 days prior, however, Ukrainian forces eliminated 1,090 of Putin's troops. Another example occurred on January 17, when Russia lost 1,130 personnel. These numbers are not anomalies. Ukraine inflicting fewer than 1,000 casualties is the exception. The norm is significantly higher. Worse for Russia, many of these daily casualties are killed in action, KIA. Michael Kaufman, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, has revealed that Russia's killed-to-wounded ratio is far from optimal. Kaufman reported a near 1-to-1 ratio of killed to severely wounded, noting that the proportion of Russian soldiers killed versus wounded has risen markedly in 2025. Logically, this is a serious problem for Putin. Wounded soldiers can often return to the fight after recovery. A dead soldier must be replaced. With a 1-to-1 killed-to-wounded ratio, Russia must find roughly 500 replacements each day for those lost. In total, Ukraine's Ministry of Finance states that Russia has lost more than 1.24 million personnel to death, wounds, capture, or detention. Although the 1-to-1 ratio applies only to recent casualties, it does not alter the fact that the Russian military is burning through a critical resource, manpower, absolutely essential to victory in maneuver warfare. That alone is bad enough. But as Smart observed, Russia is depleted not only in manpower, but also in equipment. Farrer added that after drawing down strategic reserves of armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, tanks, and artillery, Russia now has only 2,000 tanks remaining in storage. Farrer asserted that Russia began the war with 40,000 tanks, implying that Ukraine has destroyed 38,000. Even Ukrainian figures are not that high, with the Ministry of Finance reporting approximately 11,600 tanks destroyed. Setting aside disputes over exact numbers, Farrer's central point is that Russia is not delivering new tanks to its troops. Russia will claim the tanks it sends are new production. What it actually delivers, and cynically calls new, are Soviet-era hulks restored as well as possible using parts cannibalized from decaying storage lots no longer capable of yielding serviceable vehicles.
Russia's tank production industry is certainly not thriving, as Forbes revealed in a February 3rd article. The outlet noted that UVZ, the sole state-owned defense enterprise capable of producing genuinely new tanks, specifically the T-90M that Putin once called the world's best main battle tank, does not achieve the output Russia claims, and even at claimed levels, it is insufficient to offset losses in Ukraine. The official figure is 250 new T-90s per year. Simple arithmetic shows that 11,600 tanks destroyed over 4 years equates to an annual loss of 2,900. Thus, new tanks represent less than 1/10 of the equipment Russia sends to the front, even assuming the 250 per year figure is accurate.
Forbes suggested the real number may be below 200 or even 100, lending credence to Farrer's assessment. If Russia is replacing tanks lost in Ukraine, it must be drawing them from somewhere other than production lines, yielding only a few hundred annually. They are coming from Soviet-era storage, and Farrer explained why this is bad news for Russia's war effort. A new tank is assigned to a unit. What rolls off the rail car and into your position is a 1962 vintage T-62. And I don't need to tell anyone that its metallurgy is not up to modern standards, Farrer said, adding, it doesn't have sensors, right? It has only optical sights. These are only marginally better than the tanks Russia fielded in World War II. In the coming minutes, the impact of this severe tank shortage on Russian maneuver warfare will be explained. First, however, attention turns to the Donbas region. This eastern Ukrainian area is the scene of the most intense fighting. Putin is attempting to seize Donetsk Oblast from Ukrainian control while already holding most of Luhansk. Russian forces have, however, spent more than a year bogged down in the battle for Pokrovsk, a city immediately in front of the formidable fortress belt of heavily fortified urban centers, where the carnage at Pokrovsk will pale beside what awaits Russian troops beyond. The Donbas is a perfect real-time example of the Kremlin strategy failing. It also shows that when Russia manages to assemble sufficient equipment for an offensive resembling the early war mechanized thrusts, those attacks typically disintegrate in record time.
Such units are destroyed before or shortly after launching. They never achieve their objectives, Farah stated. He added that maneuver warfare remains the ultimate decisive factor in the Ukraine war, and this is where Putin's largest problems arise. Russia has lost so much manpower and equipment that it will lose the ability to prosecute the Ukraine war in the manner it desires by early 2026. Farah cited UK defense intelligence in making this judgment. ISW has reached a similar conclusion, however. Reporting on a late December ISW assessment, UNN noted that Russia cannot rebuild the strategic reserves needed to replace frontline losses without pulling troops from other active sectors in Ukraine. In other words, ironically, Russia would have to outmaneuver itself to have any chance of taking the Donbas.
By stripping troops from other sectors, existing Russian flanks would become under strength and vulnerable to counterattacks that allow Ukraine to retake territory Russia has seized. That may be what is occurring in the Kupiansk direction at present. For Russia, therefore, taking such a step in one direction is effectively equivalent to surrendering in another. It is a form of stalemate, despite a fluid front line. Russian equipment and manpower losses are so severe that Putin has no alternative to this approach, while hoping Ukraine somehow forgets how to kill his soldiers and destroy his equipment. Putin's only other viable option is the political solution he is attempting to obtain through lies, such as claiming Russia has captured Kupiansk. Russia is increasingly desperate for a political solution it cannot achieve militarily.
It is clear Russia cannot achieve military victory. It has been waging war against Ukraine since 2014. And what has it accomplished? Smart asked. The numbers tell the story. The most critical areas of Donetsk remain in Ukrainian hands. In the Donbas, since 2014, Russia has seized only 20% of Ukrainian territory. Note that this figure includes the Crimean Peninsula, illegally annexed in 2014, and the ground Russia took in the opening months of the full-scale invasion. Since then, annual gains have been minimal. ISW data show that in 2025, Russia seized an additional 2,171 square miles of Ukrainian territory, equivalent to 0.93% of the country's total area. These are not the results expected from a nation that supposedly mastered maneuver warfare. With equipment problems now fully exposed, Russia cannot expect a future in which its rate of advance accelerates significantly. Farah pointed out that for Russia to take the Donbas militarily, it would have to expend roughly another 1 million troops over several more years. That is why Russia is currently pressing the United States to honor the so-called Anchorage understandings stemming from an August meeting between Putin and President Donald Trump in Alaska. Russia appears to be suggesting that the U.S. promised to force Ukraine to cede the Donbas in exchange for peace, an effort that has so far yielded nothing for Putin. Russia, knowing it cannot take the Donbas through clever maneuver or even brute force, has been reduced to begging for a political solution to a military problem. All of this brings the discussion back to tanks, equipment, and Russia's traditional way of war. Let us examine what that approach actually entails. For Russia, it begins with rapid movement and is supposed to end with breaking the enemy through attrition. Defense Horizon Journal outlined what the Kremlin sought to execute and for a time managed to do in the Ukraine war. Russia opened the conflict with a blitzkrieg-style invasion, sending mechanized columns across Ukraine to seize as much territory as possible. In Putin's ideal scenario, those tanks would have rolled into Kyiv within days, enabling Russian forces to topple the Ukrainian government and assume control. That did not happen, but Russia was prepared. After seizing large swaths of ground in the initial maneuver phase, Russia shifted to attrition warfare. A target would be selected, and Russian infantry would conduct systematic assaults supported by human wave attacks, continuous artillery barrages, and, of course, tanks. The idea was to bleed Ukraine dry by exhausting its defenders and depleting all ammunition, leading to the collapse of the target's defenses. Russia would then occupy, reconstitute, and move to the next objective. Farrer summarized it more concisely. The great Soviet war machine, and indeed all 20th century combined arms maneuver doctrine, dictates that you prepare the objective with heavy artillery, assault with tanks, followed by mechanized infantry, and exploit breakthroughs by pushing tanks forward. By now, the flaw in this approach in 2026 is likely apparent. Ukraine's UAV-based defense system has inflicted devastating losses on the tactics Russia employs, and the numbers prove it. As noted earlier, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense claims more than 11,600 Russian tanks destroyed. Add nearly 24,000 armored vehicles, over 1,600 multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS, and nearly 37,000 artillery pieces to the loss list, and it is clear that the core components of Russia's maneuver warfare strategy have disintegrated. That explains what is being observed in the Donbas and elsewhere in Ukraine today. With so much equipment lost and not replaced, Russian mechanized attacks have become rare. In Farrer's words, it turns out that for $1,500, a Mavic drone fitted with an RPG warhead can disable any tank. Russia never accounted for that possibility early in the war, and by the time it recognized the damage Ukrainian UAVs could inflict, it was too late. All Russia has left is an insufficient number of newly produced tanks, plus countless Soviet-era armored vehicles and weapons no longer suited to 21st century warfare. That means large-scale maneuvers are now impossible. That era has passed for Russia and will not return, which is why only minimal gains are observed today. Russia has been seen attempting to adapt, but with severely limited armored vehicles and artillery to launch the kinds of attacks that once formed the backbone of Russian military doctrine, Putin has been forced to rely on the one resource he believed he possessed in abundance: manpower. Back in September, Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrsky, stated that Ukraine had observed an interesting shift in Russian tactics. Instead of assaulting Ukrainian positions with mechanized columns and large troop concentrations, Russia was moving to a far more stealth-oriented approach. The new tactic involves forming units of only 4 soldiers each. These units are then tasked with attempting to bypass Ukraine's UAV defenses in ways that armored vehicles and larger equipment cannot. Their main task is to penetrate as deeply as possible into our territory, then withdraw, regroup, advance again, and strike targets deep inside to paralyze our logistics and troop rotation, Syrsky said in September. For a time, the method produced some results. Russia was at least able to turn areas under Ukrainian control into gray zones with sporadic Russian presence. Problems soon became apparent, however. Such small units lack the combat power to seize major cities, especially without armored support. What began to occur was that Ukrainian UAVs would locate and eliminate most infiltrators. Those who managed to cross Ukrainian lines typically ended up isolated and encircled. They could still cause disruption and even kill some Ukrainian troops, but in reality, these small units could not accomplish the tasks Russia needs tanks and artillery for. What appeared on the surface to be a clever adaptation by the Russian military was in fact an admission of what has already been established.
Russia lacks the equipment necessary to seize and hold territory, and its soldiers are dying in record numbers each day. That brings the discussion to what appears to be Russia's last hope for sustaining offensive intensity against Ukraine. As Smart and Ferrer noted, Russia has resorted to recruiting foreign mercenaries, often deceiving them with promises that they will never be sent to the front line to compensate for declining troop numbers.
All of this is part of a strategy Ferrer said was pioneered by Russia's notorious mercenary outfit, the Wagner Group. The group was heavily engaged in the Battle of Bakhmut, where Ferrer claimed Russia lost approximately 130,000 troops. That figure may be contested. In June 2023, Pravda reported Western estimates placed Russian losses at around 60,000. Either way, Russia's strategy in that battle was not to send well-trained soldiers to capture Bakhmut. Russia sent fresh meat, human shields, and the recruitment of foreigners who typically produce individuals called soldiers, but who possess no military training, was conducted for the same purpose. Ferrer stated, Wagner, the pioneer of this technique, didn't need a trained soldier. You just need somebody with boots, hand him a rifle, drop a UAV overhead, and say, walk in that direction until you find Ukrainians, and then we'll know where the Ukrainians are, because they're shooting at you. The logic appeared to be that it is preferable to lose a human shield than to lose a piece of military equipment. But now that Russia no longer has sufficient equipment, human shields have become the primary strategy. The Ukraine war has largely become a contest between Ukrainian drones and dying Russian soldiers. It is a war Putin cannot win. He knows it, Ukraine knows it, and Ukraine's task is to ensure Putin's political maneuvering does not obscure the reality that Russia failed in maneuver warfare long ago, and Putin has run out of options. Russia now understands what comprehensive defeat looks like, and there is another area of Ukraine where everything discussed in this analysis is playing out. Russia is attempting to capture Volchansk without armored support, and the results are exactly what one would predict. Comment number 2 if you support Ukraine, number 3 if you support Russia, and number 4 if you favor peace.